Hello everybody, you're listening to the Polymath radio show with your host, Daniel Aaron Levy. For those of you who are new here, as always, this is an unscripted, off-the-cuff, and conversational educational show where I talk about things which I find interesting that I think you guys will find interesting as well. And today's episode is why the West industrialized first. And today we're going to answer this question drawing on history, politics, political psychology, and a little bit of economics as well. So let's get into it. Let's first just take a look at what industrialization actually was. Now, industrialization in kind of its modern context can have different meanings because there's actually been more than one industrial revolution. In fact, in kind of contemporary historiography, there's listed up to three. The first industrial revolution took place in the late 1700s and involved steam engines. The second industrial revolution took place in the late 1800s and involved electricity, the new kind of internal combustion engine, the new electrical and chemical industries, and the kind of various inventions and transport changes that these industries spawned. And the third industrial revolution took place in the mid-1900s and involved telecommunications. Some experts talk about a fourth industrial revolution that's going to be coming soon with the advent of AI and also automation being used lost my train of thought, and also automation being used more widely in industry. But in this episode, we're going to be talking about the first industrial revolution, because from this first industrial revolution, all the subsequent ones were spawned. The first industrial revolution is the key which transformed the kind of landscape of human society and led to all the other ones. So the Industrial Revolution, in the first incarnation of it, in the way that we received it first, occurring in Britain in the latter half of the 1700s, was when fossil fuels, specifically coal, was used to power steam engines, and that was used to mass-produce manufactured goods. Now, living in industrial society, we take Industrial Revolution for granted, but it's such a revolutionary and rare event that it could be seen as a great filter. Let me just explain that. In the sort of explanation for why human beings haven't seen aliens yet, why alien life has not contacted Earth, there's a theory called the Great Filter Theory, which basically suggests that in order to create a kind of galaxy-spanning or planet-faring civilization, there are multiple great filters so kind of great barriers that a civilization has to cross in order to reach that point. So a great barrier could be, for example, the evolution of multicellular life. It could be the evolution of intelligent life. It could be industrialization. It could be a society living past the advent of nuclear weapons without nuking each other. It could be the discovery of faster than light travel. We don't know. It's just some sort of large barrier to civilization that humanity may or may not have already passed. And in terms of the Great Filter Theory, there's lots of different kind of contending versions of it, where different people kind of posit what could a great filter be, for example, or what could be credible examples of a great filter. But I think industrialization is a perfectly credible example of what a great filter could be. It's such a rare event. I mean, humanity existed for tens of thousands of years. I mean, Homo sapiens evolved, I think, 200,000 years ago. We existed for tens of thousands of years without anything like that. Even in the first advent of modern states in about 4,000 or 3,500 BCE, depending on who you ask and what your criteria are, humanity went for millennia so far away from the Industrial Revolution, just as agricultural societies. Like, an Industrial Revolution was such a completely revolutionary event that completely changed the face of humanity. And as I'm going to try and explain in this episode, it could only have happened in Great Britain when it did. And again, we're going to try and kind of go through that. So we need to ask ourselves, what are the prerequisites for industrialization? I.e., what do we need for steam engines to exist, for people to actually buy and use them, and to power them, and to use them specifically for the mass production of manufactured goods? Now, we can divide these prerequisite reasons into four kind of categories, which I've devised. Obviously, the kind of theory of why Great Britain industrialized first wasn't made or initiated by me. There's a huge body of scholarly work, of which I'm really just sort of summarizing the consensus and the synthesis of here. But I've just, for the sake of this episode, kind of categorized them in four categories. these kind of various reasons in 4 categories: technical, economic, politico-economic, and political. Of course, there's some overlap between all of these. And actually, if we look at these reasons, and we're going to, don't worry, but as we look at these reasons, we can also see that the ease and the speed to which industrialization spread to other regions of the world from Great Britain depended on the possession of these conditions. For example, it spread to Belgium first, so for example in like the early 1800s, because the technical, political, politico-economic, and economic conditions in Belgium were most similar to those of Great Britain. It spread to Western Europe a little bit slower, spread to Eastern Europe and Russia more slowly still, Asia even slower than that, and Sub-Saharan Africa even slower than that, because the conditions of these places differed from those of Great Britain to varying extents. And this kind of ties in actually with a previous episode we did on Polymath, which was why some countries are more developed than others, and the kind of basic reason for that were the institutional conditions of that. The institutions of each country, which explains why it's developed or developing or least developed, etc. I'm not going to get into that too much here, just because that's really material for another episode, but the conditions that we're talking about, the prerequisites for industrialization that we're going to be talking about in this episode, are mostly in themselves institutions. So it still serves as an explanator for both industrialization and development as a whole. If you can hear the rustling of paper here, that's just sort of the kind of, I have like a bullet point notes page for each episode I do, but just to reiterate, it is not a script, as I said. So, let's get started kind of exploring these different reasons. So, technical reasons. Making a steam engine. How the hell do we make a steam engine? Now, I can't tell you how to make a steam engine because I'm not an engineer, but what I do know is that making a steam engine is damn hard. And here's the thing. There have been huge scientific and technical advances made in history by pre-modern cultures. But there comes a point of technical advancement, for example, a steam engine, or specifically the kind of working functional iterations of a steam engine, where we need a bit more than just traditional human ingenuity. We need the scientific method and a culture of science, empiricism, learning, and rationalism. Let's just explain a bunch of that really quickly. The scientific method is basically how we do modern science now. And it's basically, we take a theory or a hypothesis, we test it with experiments, trying to keep all the different, like as many variables as we can constant. And then we see the results, and then we draw a conclusion based on that. And that's kind of the basic of the scientific method. It's, in a wider sense, it's about skepticism. It's about saying, we're not going to believe this just because our ancestors or tradition or common sense say that this is so. We're going to test it out ourselves under experimental conditions. And this might sound elementary to you guys because, you know, you go to school and you learn the scientific method as a matter of course, because it's one of the foundations of modern civilization. But actually, in terms of human history, the scientific method was revolutionary. It developed only in the 1600s in Europe. There are some antecedents for it in ancient Greece. And in fact, we're going to be talking about ancient Greece in a future episode, which is something to look forward to because I'm actually really looking forward to it myself and I think it's going to be interesting. But the scientific method in its modern iteration developed only in the 1600s. Like after 5,600 years of human civilization that developed. It took a long damn time. Let's also just kind of explore the terms of rationalism. Rationalism is the belief that the world can be explained by the power of human reason. And again, that sounds really elementary to us, but it hasn't been like that for the vast majority of human history. The idea of rationalism comes from, again, Europe, both in ancient Greece and also a bit later in a period in Europe called the Renaissance, which took place from about 1300 to 1600 AD. The Renaissance is when the kind of roots of modern rationalism came in, but rationalism really became a kind of force in the collective psychology of educated peoples of Europe in like the 1600s and the 1700s. Empiricism is again the idea that we can sort of, to gain knowledge about the world, we engage in observation and just looking at it. And again, with empiricism, it's a sort of scientific philosophical movement that emerged, you guessed it, in ancient Greece and also in Europe in around the Renaissance first. It had its kind of roots in that period and then it came to full fruition in the 1600s and 1700s. And that may seem a little bit silly. We might be thinking, well, of course the exercise of human reason, surely that has to be universal. But the thing is though, until Europe in the kind of centuries immediately preceding the Industrial Revolution, it wasn't part of social psychology in the same way. Pre-modern human societies were based mostly on the ideas of tradition and the way that things had always been done. The idea of consciously seeking to evaluate the principles of human society and evaluate and constantly assess the ways of life that people had. The idea of constantly doing that is actually remarkably new in history. That's just not how pre-modern societies work. They just didn't do that. And I mean, that's not to say that pre-modern societies didn't make great technical advances. I mean, for example, ancient China, the ultimate kind of the archetypal pre-modern great empire, made huge advances in sciences. And for example, in even like Europe until the early modern era was something of a scientific backwater. I mean, the real scientific developments occurring in that in that rough period were actually in the Islamic world. And we can see that in the Islamic Golden Age, this kind of massive period of scientific and technical flourishing that we see in the Islamic Middle East and North Africa from around 700 to 1200. But the kind of the idea of reason as the key element to human thought, as a key element in human social psychology, rather than the force of tradition or rather than the force of religion, is a remarkable innovation in history. And I cannot stress that enough. And Europe gained these with, as I said, the 1600s and the 1700s. But what actually happened? So the first thing to talk about is in the 1600s. Actually, I'm going to look up the exact date. I think it's said to have begun in the late 1500s and ended in the mid 1600s with an institution, or not an institution, a phenomenon called the Scientific Revolution. Yeah, so that's right. It's said to have started. Wikipedia dates it as the start date in 1543 and the end date in 1687, although those start dates are actually quite largely disputed by historians. And what the scientific was this kind of phenomenon in Western history. It's a kind of a psychological and a technical phenomenon where we have the emergence of modern science. We have these huge technical and scientific advances. So, for example, the development of the invention of the microscope, for example, or the telescope, for example, and also the beginning of the modern fields of chemistry, astronomy, etc., and also physics. I mean, Isaac Newton was classically kind of writing his theories during this era. And in fact, Isaac Newton's work, De Principia Mathematica, is often seen as the sort of crowning achievement or the culmination of the scientific revolution. It's also a social psychology phenomenon because it's in this period, with these technical advances, the views of society about nature were transformed. And more importantly, the views on society about learning and knowledge itself were transformed. Because we see the emergence of this culture of questioning things and the use of reason and rationalism and learning through deduction and observation and experimentation in the natural world. The point is that the scientific revolution was both a scientific phenomenon and a technical phenomenon. And it was essential in kind of giving humans in Europe the ability to even create something or fathom something like a steam engine. The other key institution we need to talk about is something called the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was a European phenomenon, again, occurring in the 1700s, again, European, because it was very much linked to the scientific revolution. And it's sort of the assertion of, the difference of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment is that in the scientific revolution, we see the emergence of rationalism and empiricism as these strong forces, established forces in social psychology. But in the Enlightenment, we see a new brand of social psychology. And by that, I just sort of mean the ideas which lay in the minds of educated men and women as well, but I'm using men because obviously in this period of history, unfortunately due to quite endemic sexism, the main thinkers of the period were all men, and the main kind of historical actors of the period were all men, although there are some very influential female thinkers, and at times quite influential female figures in politics as well. Anyway, I'm getting on a digression. In the Enlightenment, the idea of Enlightenment thought, which spread to quite a few quarters of educated European opinion, was that rationalism and kind of empiricism and the kind of ideas of science and progress should be prioritized over those of tradition and religion. The Enlightenment in Europe was an explicit rejection of religion and tradition as ways of explaining human life. It was a rejection of religion as a dominant social force. It was saying, no, we should start separating church and religion and state, for example. We shouldn't let religion inform how we conduct politics and the laws we make for society. We should base these things on the exercise of reason and on the values of tolerance and humanity. And the Enlightenment did a lot to kind of solidify a culture of learning and, most importantly, of questioning. Not just questioning kind of pervading wisdom, but questioning political truths as well. The political kind of implications of the Enlightenment are also really, really important, and I could talk about them heavily, but we're going to get a little bit more into that later. The point is that the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment created the social psychological atmosphere for people to rapidly start innovating and experimenting, and therefore making some really impressive scientific progress that led to the perfection of the steam engine. And I say perfection because early iterations of the steam engine actually predate both of these phenomena by quite a long way. In fact, a primitive steam engine called the heliopile was invented in the Roman Empire in, I think, the 2nd century AD, which begs the question, in fact, why didn't the Roman Empire then develop that technology and industrialize? Don't worry, we're gonna get on that. We're getting on that very quickly, actually. But basically, the social psychology of experimentation and rationalism and kind of empiricism and questioning things developed really in the form that we're used to in modern civilization only twice in history. In ancient Greece, from the period between around 1000 or 1100 BCE, but in the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization, and in about maybe around 300 BCE, when the Macedonians began to conquer Greece. So it occurred once in that period, and then it occurred again in Europe during the early modern era. And I mean, this really begs the question of why this stuff happened in Europe. And in fact, that's gonna be the topic of a future episode. Like the idea of why is it that Europe developed so much more than the other kind of vast empires and great countries of the world. That phenomenon actually is known as the Great Divergence. It's this kind of the historical phenomenon of Western society pulling ahead of all other societies in standard of living, GDP per capita, and general development. And we're going to be talking about the Great Divergence a bit more in future episodes. A very brief summary of a potential thesis could be that because Europe, if you look at the geography of Europe, it's really geographically divided. You have loads of peninsula, you have lots of mountain ranges, lots of great forests, and it basically means that it's really hard for one single state to consolidate all of that continent and rule all of that continent. Whereas if you look at, for example, China, the geography of China is much more conducive to a great empire conquering all that land and holding it and ruling all that land under a single state, which in fact was indeed the case for many periods of Chinese history. I've used China as an example, but the general principle applies to all the kind of great pre-modern states. So, India, kind of the Middle East between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, where civilization first developed, Egypt, the Middle East, kind of where the Ottoman Empire developed, etc., etc., etc. You have these kind of great, powerful polities ruling large areas of land. Whereas in Europe, you have this geographical fragmentation, which leads to political fragmentation. You have lots of different states. And the thing is, though, they're all competing with each other, which means that they're forced to either innovate or they simply just get conquered by other countries. They have to keep competing with each other. They have to keep embracing new ideas. They have to keep changing. And also that culture of having, like the idea of having a multiplicity in states and constant competition also encourages a bit more innovation and just change from established social psychological norms. A change from the established conservatism of the vast majority of pre-modern societies of this is the way that we've always done things, or our ancestors have told us that we should do this a certain way, or we should think in a certain way, and therefore that's what we're going to do. And we see this really classically, again, to return to the example, in ancient China, which was so slow to embrace industrialization and modern technology in the 1800s, in no small part because it contradicted all the received wisdom and philosophy of ancient Chinese social psychology at the time, which was to keep doing things in the way that the ancestors have done things, to keep doing things in the way that we've constantly done things. Now, Another technical factor is the availability of coal, which was extremely important in the kind of in the early phase of industrialization. But I think even though Great Britain classically has a really large availability of domestic coal, I personally think that if all other factors align, if all the other conditions for industrialization are ripe, something like the native availability of coal isn't going to be a massive limiting factor. It may delay the onset of industrialization, but if all the other conditions are present, I think there'd be other ways of acquiring coal, for example, or substitute fossil fuels that you could use. Or even, you could still power a steam engine with charcoal, which is developed from wood. In fact, the only reason why Britain turned so heavy towards coal in the 1700s was because deforestation had reached a significant enough extent that charcoal was no longer a reliable fuel source. So that's just something to point out here. Now let's move on to economic factors. What are the economic factors causing industrialization? The key economic prerequisite, one of the key prerequisites in general to industrialization as it unfolded, was capitalism. The development and the formation of capitalism in early modern Europe. And it's important to ask ourselves, what is capitalism? Capitalism, technically, is an economic system, just economic, where the means of production are owned privately and for the purpose of generating a profit. What does that mean? It basically means that in capitalism, the ways of making things, whether it be a farm for making food, a fishery for making fish, not making, but you know what I mean, a mine for making or producing raw materials, a factory for producing raw material goods, are owned by private individuals who operate these things in order to make a profit. In a wider sense, capitalism isn't just an economic phenomenon, it's a political and a socio-cultural phenomenon. And it's about the idea of capitalism is that society is not prearranged into hierarchical classes who have a duty to do a certain thing. I.e., society is not arranged into a clergy whose duty it is to pray, a warrior group such as knights or samurai whose duty it is to fight, a peasant group whose duty it is to labor, but rather a mass of individuals who are allowed to enter market relationships with each other, i.e. to conduct transactions with each other at will without legal prohibition or interference from the state, and who are allowed to make profit, and where indeed money is the kind of there is an accepted commercial medium for these transactions to take place. The contrast to capitalism, which as I said, developed in early modern Europe mainly as a consequence of colonialism, the alternative to capitalism, which we see for pre-modern societies, is instead an organizing society based on different hierarchical castes, or classes, kind of arranged in an explicit hierarchy, where the relations between these classes is not transaction-based necessarily, but more based on duty. So, for example, let's take medieval European feudalism. The relationship between a peasant and a lord in feudalism isn't a free market relationship. It's that peasant is legally bound to this land. That peasant cannot leave. That peasant has to farm that land. They also have to farm the lord's land and swear fealty and obedience to that lord. They also have to do certain duties for the lord, certain chores for him, for example. They also have to use that lord's equipment. So, for example, using the lord's mill to make their bread, or to grind their grain, rather. They are legally inferior to their lord. They have legally fewer rights. And in return, they also owe military service to that lord. So if that lord mobilizes them to fight, they have to obey that. In return, their lord gives them protection and justice, i.e. the lord will arbitrate disputes between that peasant and another peasant, and will also, or at least nominally, prevent some other lord from just coming in and massacring all of them. Not all pre-modern societies, and by pre-modern I mean all human societies that emerged from the first civilizations in 4000 BC to before 1789, let's say, not all pre-modern societies were explicitly feudal, but they were all explicitly hierarchical, and where the relations between the hierarchies was defined not by free market transactions, but by duties and laws. And any kind of economic order of that kind is completely contradictory towards the development of industrialization, because industrialization is fundamentally a capitalistic phenomenon. The emergence of capitalism was just a prerequisite for industrialization for just so many different reasons, both for economic reasons in supplying the free labor, and also the kind of class of businessmen and merchants who are able to operate these machines and amass the capital to do so, and who are freely able to do so without interference from an aristocracy or from the state, without the state taking away that property, for example. Also a kind of class of landless laborers who weren't bound to the land, i.e. to the countryside, and who were therefore able to work. Capitalism was essential for the amount of capital needed for industrialization to take place. It was essential for the kind of culture, that social psychology of business relationships and commerce and transactions, and the idea of a market and the idea of profit and buying and selling. All of that is essential for something like industrialization to happen. It just never would have happened without it. We're going to be exploring a little bit more about why that is as this episode continues, but I just really want to impress that and make that clear. So, how did Europe actually develop capitalism? I've already given some inkling of it by mentioning that it came from colonialism, but essentially the root of capitalism was actually something called the Commercial Revolution, and it occurred in the 11th century, and it basically occurred when Italy, at the time, Italy for the preceding centuries had been under feudal authority, but in the 11th century, the feudal authority that previously had ruled Italy became much weaker and less able to impose its power. And as a result, Italy became organized not on a feudal level, but it became organized into the whole peninsula became filled with lots of competing city-states who engaged in commerce and trade in order to make their money and to establish their way of life. And this led to the developing of banking as a phenomenon, again in Italy and around the 1300s, at the start of something called the Renaissance, which was this cultural and social phenomenon, this great movement in Europe. Colonization from various Western European countries also encouraged trade and commerce, and also development of a class of people who are involved in trade and commerce, i.e. a merchant class, a mercantile class, a trading class. In the 1600s and the 1700s, we see the development of modern banking and modern finance, and also that key phenomenon of credit, which is basically, like, let's say, a bank basically saying, I'm going to give you this money on the condition that you pay me back for it later. All of these things were essential innovations towards the development of capitalism, and modern finance and banking comprises a key part of capitalism today. Now, we've been talking about capitalism in general as an economic prerequisite for the Industrial Revolution, but let's just deep dive into what specifically we need for the Industrial Revolution. Firstly, we need people to work the machines. We need people to actually be in the factories. And for this, we need a class of laboring people who don't own land, who i.e. aren't working land for their own subsistence, but are instead making subsistence by being paid for their labor. And in Britain, the process that led to this there were two key processes. The first of which was called the Agricultural Revolution. And the Agricultural Revolution occurred mainly in the 1600s and was basically saw this massive rise in the productivity of agriculture, such as that in order to feed more people, far less farming land and therefore farming people were required. And in this massive increase in agricultural productivity, basically means that one person could feed more people than before, which basically means that you can now have a greater number of people engaged in factory work, i.e. living in towns or cities and not producing their own food from the countryside, but rather receiving money and using that to buy food. And that would have been impossible before the Agricultural Revolution, i.e. industrialization would have been impossible before the Agricultural Revolution, because agriculture simply wasn't productive enough to support that. In pre-modernity, agriculture has been productive enough to support a small class of elites who, instead of working to produce their own food, have been busy fighting or praying or ruling. It was only with the Agricultural Revolution that agriculture became productive enough to support a large group of laboring working people. Another key institution in Britain, which led to the formation of a landless labouring class to fuel industrialisation, was a legislative process called the Enclosure Acts, which occurred mainly in the 1700s, but have their kind of roots in earlier centuries. And the Enclosure Acts were basically this huge series of legislation and this large kind of political and economic transformation, where the lands of England, which had previously been, or a large part of the lands of England, had been owned and operated in common by peasants. So they were all able to kind of use that common land for the grazing of their of their animals, for example. So the grazing of their livestock, for the gathering of common resources such as firewood from forests. And this common land was divided into strips of land, which were each kind of worked by peasants. And each peasant could move from one strip of land to the other. They can move between strips of land freely. The Enclosure Acts were a series of changes in the 1700s whereby large landowners enclosed all of this common land, i.e. made it inaccessible to other people, and by doing so deprived lots of peasants of their source of livelihood, i.e. the land which they needed to survive. And because these peasants no longer had any land, they were then forced to, in order to live, i.e. avoid starving to death in the streets, not the streets, because it would be like in villages, in the fields, I guess, starving to death in the fields, these labourers had to come to the towns and cities in order to work for wages, whereby they provided the raw kind of manpower to push industrialisation through. This, by the way, the necessity of a landless labour class that we see, the emergence of which we see in Britain in the 1700s or so, is essential for industrialisation and does a lot to explain why different countries industrialised at the pace that they did. Because in Europe, for example, or indeed most of human history before modernity, peasants were bound to their land. They were not legally allowed to stop farming their land. They were forced to do that. And one of the names of this institution, or at least the name of this institution in medieval and early modern Europe, was called serfdom, i.e. a serf was a European peasant who was legally unfree, i.e. they could not leave their land. They had more rights than slaves, but they were not free people legally because they could not choose to do what they wanted. They had to work their land and they had to also work their lord's land as well. They had to provide agricultural labor, not just to make their own living, but to produce food for their lord as well. And the institution of serfdom is characteristic of Europe since, say, around about the 500s, 600s AD after the fall of the Roman Empire. Different countries such as France actually abolished serfdom quite early. So France abolished serfdom in the 1300s, for example, but most of Europe retained serfdom until the advent of the late modern era, i.e. the era in human history starting from 1789, the day of the French Revolution. Serfdom is a particularly European phenomenon, but all across the world in pre-modern states, peasants, or i.e. the common man, has been legally unfree. They have been forced to work their land. And if they're forced to work their land, they can't then come to towns and cities and provide labour for industrialisation. So that massively stymies industrial development. France, incidentally, I mentioned France because France abolished serfdom in the 1300s. But as a result of the French Revolution and the reforms introduced in that period and directly after it, it basically gave lots of legal protection to peasants. Basically giving lots of legal protection to peasants and preventing them from being kicked off their land, which is an admirable measure in the way that the Enclosure Acts in Britain were a morally reprehensible measure in that they deprived thousands of people of their livelihood. But the consequence of this admirable measure in France was to mean that the maintenance of a strong peasantry really stymied the flow of labour to the towns and cities. And that kind of really stymied the pace of French industrialisation. And again, I'm not making moral judgments here. I mean, many of the developments that have led to the formation of industrialisation in Britain were reprehensible. For example, as I mentioned, the Enclosure Acts, but also the conditions of the average British labourer in the early stages of industrialisation were also absolutely horrific and arguably much, much worse than agricultural labourers and farmers at the time. But that's just not the point of what we're discussing here. We're talking about industrialisation and industrial/economic development, but that is something important to keep in mind. So, we've established that we need a free group of people to work the machines. By the way, incidentally, this is why slavery and all the kind of great empires of, great as in large and powerful, not morally good, all the great empires of history whose economy was built on slaves, for example, the Roman Empire, they never industrialized because They just didn't have the free labor needed. In part, there were many reasons why they didn't industrialize, part of which we talked about already. For example, the lack of a scientific revolution and an enlightenment, and also other reasons which we're going to mention in the future. But that's just something to keep in mind. The presence of slavery or serfdom or any kind of unfree labor basically prevents the kind of homegrown development of industrialization. Again, this goes a long way to explaining why Great Britain specifically industrialized first, and not some vast, powerful empire of the past, because Britain had abolished domestic slavery a long, long time ago, many centuries before the 1700s. It continued to maintain overseas slavery, of course, but that's a different matter. So, we've established that we need people to work the machines. We also need people to buy the machines, to buy the steam engines. And this requires, first of all, a social class of businessmen and merchants who are willing to do that. They're not deriving their livelihood from being feudal lords, living off the land, living off the labor of peasants. They're gaining their livelihood from capitalism, i.e. from the generation of profit through kind of capitalistic activities such as trade, commerce, and manufacture. And the development of that modern business class, these modern business classes, was first occurring in Britain in the 1700s. And there are antecedents for that. So, for example, I mentioned that Italy had a commercial revolution in the 11th century where we see the formation of modern business classes. But in terms of raw size, raw numbers, and in terms of a proportion of society, Great Britain was really the leading figure in the development of these modern business classes. We also need capital available to these business classes in order to make them able to even get steam engines. What is capital in this case? Capital, the general definition of capital is just resources. And capital could be money. That's a classic example of what capitalism is. It could be physical resources. It could also be something called human capital, which is like someone's level of education, for example. So the kind of intangible resources that go into what gives value on a market. Again, capital is a really classic term that's only applicable, it's a really classic term that could only have become a thing with the advent of capitalism. Because again, the advent of capitalism sees the world and sees economic relationships in terms of value and of capital, i.e. resources, and of profit. Capital is a fundamentally, it's a quite modern idea. And the idea of capital can't really apply to pre-modern societies which don't have a conception of organizing society in terms of value, profit, and capital. Now, in Great Britain specifically in the 1700s, there was lots of capital available. Britain, uniquely among all countries in the world, apart from maybe the Netherlands or Belgium, had a developed financial and banking system where lots of credit was available to people. Britain, quite uniquely in the time as well. I mean, there were rich countries at the time, but Britain was an example of a wealthy country, and, much more rarely in world history, a country where the businessmen and the traders, and not just the great feudal aristocrats, were wealthy and had capital available to them as well. And that's because British history in the early modern era, that is the era of time dated from 1453 to 1789, British history is really, in the early modern era, is really about the development of trade and commerce, and empire as a way of facilitating that, and the growing amount of wealth pouring into the country as a result. This is to say that whereas there were countries in Europe much more populous than Britain, for example, Russia or France, and because there was more people in them, if you measured, say, the GDP, it may have been higher, but the amount of capital, the amount of wealth available to people in Britain was much higher than these societies. Even, in fact, observers at the time even remarked that British peasants were significantly wealthier and better off than French peasants, for example. Not that British peasants would be anywhere near wealthy enough to have the capital to get a damn steam engine or a factory, but I'm just trying to make the point that Britain, uniquely in the world at this time, had the capital available to the classes of society which were likely to spearhead industrial development. Also, the availability of capital to traders, we're getting political here, we're getting into a political factor, but if you live in a state where the government can just confiscate resources from people at will, then the actual amount of capital that's stably available to people is extremely limited because the government can just confiscate that at any time. Britain, unique among the states in this period, or at least Britain and some other countries in the world at the time of the 1700s, had this concept of private property, and of private property being an inalienable right which the government couldn't intervene in. Now again, there'll be many people here who disagree for political reasons with the values of capitalism, or the dominance of private property, or the value of private property and the great kind of societal value which we ascribe to it, and the way that society revolves around it. And that's fine. But from the perspective of industrial development is what we're talking about here. And also, for all the great inequities of capitalism, it was a key example of moral progress from the feudalism that preceded. Because in capitalism, what impression you could say is implicit in capitalism in the way that the laboring classes are treated. However, it's not explicit. Capitalism, at least formally, at least on its surface, provides for the ability of any person to make money and have private property. Feudalism is explicit. I say feudalism just as a shorthand for pre-modern systems of societal organization and economics before capitalism. Feudalism is explicitly based on oppression. It's explicitly based on hierarchy and social classes, and some social classes being better than others and having more rights than others. The idea of capitalism representing a moral advance over feudalism was in fact endorsed and popularized by Karl Marx, who divided world history into kind of human progress from slave societies of the ancient world to feudalism, to capitalism, to socialism / the dictatorship of the proletariat, and finally to communism. So the idea of capitalism being an advance on what came before it is not a right-wing or left-wing idea. It's just objective in what capitalism actually is and what the pre-modern alternatives of capitalism actually were. So, another key economic thing that was needed for industrialization is a high price for labor, because steam engines in factories require a huge initial investment of capital to get running. And if you are some person who has access to labor, you wouldn't make that initial input of capital unless it was thought to be profitable somewhere around the line. So that is to say, if labor, i.e. if the price of hiring or sustaining someone was so cheap that you could produce things for so cheap that you don't actually need to make that initial capital investment, for economic reasons, you're not going to do that. And in fact, Britain in the 1700s was where the average wage, or average standard of living of the average person was higher than anywhere else in the world. And in fact, if you look at how quickly different countries industrialize, it correlates phenomenally well to the average standard of living or the average level of wealth of the common people at the time. It also explains partly why great entities like the Roman Empire never industrialized, because of the proliferation of slavery. No business owner or no person of wealth is going to make the huge capital investment in mechanization, i.e. in using machines to produce things, when it's already so cheap to use human labor to produce things. And in fact, slave societies, such as the American South in the 1800s, were famously unindustrial. They were famously based on agriculture because there was just no incentive for industrialization there at all. So, industrialization, in economic terms, classically comes from high price of labor and high availability of capitalism. And these conditions were best met in Great Britain and were arguably only met to a significant extent in Great Britain. Although you could say that maybe Belgium or the Netherlands had these conditions as well. They just happened to industrialize later. Another economic thing that we need for industrial revolution is infrastructure, because we need to get things to and from steam engines, i.e. we need to get raw material to factories, and then we need to get manufactured goods out of factories. Now, the quality of infrastructure in the world of the 1700s was far, far worse than the quality today. But Great Britain, again, classically had the infrastructural means to do this through what's called the Canal Revolution. That's more of an informal term, but it is the term which I've seen used by historians. And it just refers to this in the kind of decades preceding industrialization. So during the 1700s and the late 1600s, there was this great tendency in Britain to build canals, which kind of allowed the cheap transport of goods. Because always in history, or at least before the advent of railways, it's been much cheaper and easier and faster to transport goods by water than by land. And the huge proliferation of built canals in Great Britain classically provided the infrastructural basis for goods to get to factories and then for goods to get out of factories to centers of distribution, such as cities or ports, for example. That's not to say that without the Canal Revolution, Britain wouldn't have industrialized, because Britain, of course, still had a network of roads, but it just illustrates the point that developed infrastructure is so important in this kind of endeavor, and that the canals provided a really great means of conveying a cheap, efficient, effective, extensive means of conveying raw materials to factories and conveying finished goods out of factories in an era where the road quality and coverage was much poorer than it is now. Also in an era where lots of roads were privatized. So if you wanted to move goods on roads, you had to keep paying tolls to the people who own the damn roads, which of course is going to be really crippling for commerce. So, this also leads us quite handily to the third major category of prerequisites for industrialization: politico-economic factors, namely raw materials. Great Britain needed raw materials, and that came from colonies. Now, the classic industry that kick-started Industrial Revolution was the cotton industry, specifically the textiles industry. And in order to kind of take raw cotton and create finished textiles that can be mass-produced, you have to, of course, have that supply of raw materials, the raw cotton. And that cotton came from Britain's colonies. Classically, it came from the West Indies and also from India. In later eras, it would come from... at this time, the cotton that the British industry used to industrialize in the late 1700s also came from the American colonies, specifically the American South. In later decades, for example in the 1800s, a lot of Britain's cotton would come from Egypt. The point is that in order to secure the raw materials that were necessary for Industrial Revolution in sufficient supplies, Great Britain heavily relied on colonies in order to secure those. Now, if let's say the technical, political, and economic conditions for industrialization were present in a country which happened to have large reserves of cotton, colonies wouldn't matter in that case. But it just so happens that due to the geography of Europe, the same geography of Europe that led to the institutions that led to industrialization also meant that the raw materials for industrialization, apart from coal and potentially iron, weren't in great quantities. So cotton had to be secured from either colonies or trade. And of course, much of it was secured from trade. For example, after the USA became independent, Great Britain got a lot of its raw materials from the American South, even when they were independent. But colonies produced a really important vehicle for producing cotton, because due to the political domination of these areas, cotton could be secured in a much cheaper way. Now here's the thing. That explains raw materials. But once you've produced a good from a factory, you need to sell that good to someone. There needs to be demand from your product. This is to say that an industrializing country needed markets. But here's the thing. At this era in history, no country, none at all, in no country was the standard of living of the common man high enough to allow them to buy these mass-produced industrial goods in sufficient enough quantities, i.e., the demand for industrialization in the early phase of industrialization, arguably until the 20th century, the demand did not come from the domestic consumer consumption of goods like textiles. It came from markets abroad. I.e., what happened was Great Britain, or British producers in the late 1700s, were able to sustain industrialization because there was demand for mass-produced manufactures, but that demand came from the various elites of lots of different countries. And this is where Britain's empire really comes into its own, because it allows the securing of markets in order to sell industrial goods to, in order to maintain industrialization. Now, the rationale for obtaining markets didn't actually emerge in Europe from industrialization. The rationale of gaining access to markets by political domination came from the early modern era in an economic doctrine called mercantilism. And mercantilism it's sort of like an early form of capitalism, and it's really based on the idea of balance of trade. I.e., in mercantilism, a country should be exporting more goods than it imports. And in order to secure markets for exports, political force needs to be deployed in order to secure countries and basically provide markets for goods. So Britain, in pursuit of this doctrine and in pursuit of wealth in general, had accrued many colonies by the late 1700s, and these many colonies provided markets. But Britain also gained markets, not just from political domination, but also not just from explicit domination, but implicit domination. We've of course heard of the British Empire, but there was also this phenomenon in the 1800s of the informal empire, which were loads of countries that were completely dependent on British manufacturers. Latin America is a really big example of this. All these countries didn't really have much industrial capacity of their own. So in order to gain manufactured goods, they exported them all from Britain or from other first world countries, but largely Britain in the late 1800s. And in return, they gave Britain raw materials like just things produced from the ground or from mines, etc. Just, i.e., they were agrarian economies which relied on Britain to gain manufactures. And this gave Britain a huge amount of influence in those countries, which allowed Britain to, in practice, control how those countries worked. Although with a good deal less actual physical, like direct control than in formal colonies. The point I'm trying to make here is that markets for Great Britain didn't just come from colonies, but also from the informal empire, i.e. that economic sphere of British control. And I mean, again, all of this kind of makes sense in the basic light of economics, which is supply and demand. So for industrialization, we needed supply, in this case of raw materials, and we need demand. We need to sell these things. Now, in fact, the history of imperialism in 1800s can really be explained quite a lot by the acquisition of markets. I mean, in the late 1800s, it's not just Britain who's the industrial power, but there's multiple industrial countries in the world. And one of the reasons why they all literally scrambled to attain colonies and to divide up the world between themselves was because they all wanted markets for their industrial goods in order to encourage the production of industrial goods, because industrialization leads to development. Famously, that is one of the basic, most fundamental, most simple and revolutionary and transformative truths of human history. Industrialization has massively, exponentially and colossally multiplied human development. You look at any graph of any measure of wealth or population as well, and you'll find it's relatively constant-ish until industrialization kicks off in the 1800s, and then it just shoots up like a massive curve. So, imperialist countries, which in the 1800s, the most powerful countries were European countries, so the imperial powers dividing the world between them were Western countries. That is to say, Europe plus the USA. That is not to say that imperialism is a phenomenon specific to Europe. Not true at all. In fact, there were even examples of when imperialist Europeans were being imperialistic towards cultures like the Maori. The Maori themselves were being imperialistic and committing genocide against other neighboring or other nearby less developed tribe called the Moriori. This is just to say that imperialism is not by any decree a European phenomenon. It is a human phenomenon of organized societies. But in the late 1800s, it just so happens that the most powerful societies in the world at the time were European, or Western rather, and therefore they had the ability to divide the rest of the world up between them. And one of the reasons why they did this was the acquisition of markets in order to kind of further their industrial development. The scramble for Africa, which is this phenomenon which occurred in the late 1800s, where the continent of Africa rapidly became divided between European powers, is an example of this. Now, finally, the political factors that are necessary for industrialization. I've been recording for so long. If this recording suddenly cuts off, like if my laptop just dies for whatever reason, and I lose this recording, I'm going to be so angry. I'm going to be so sad. But anyway, on to political factors. What political factors do we need for industrialization to happen? Well, tying into what I mentioned about capitalism earlier, we need the ideas of private property, rule of law, and some innovations of modern politics, i.e. no guilds, or kind of serfdom. What do I mean by that? Private property refers to a phenomenon where people as individuals are allowed to own things, and the state or indeed any kind of powerful force, can't just take those things away from them for no reason. This is crucial to the development of capitalism, because without private property, there is no reason to make any investment at all, because you could lose it at any time. The rule of law is a political phenomenon in which authority in society, what you are obeying in society, is not some autocrat whose word is will, but rather a code of law which provides a consistent, constant kind of basis for what is or isn't legal in a society. I.e., the law is, or kind of what's legal is not just dependent on the whims of like some guy at the top who can just say one day, oh yeah, it's illegal to be richer than me, and then anyone who's richer than him gets put to death. But rather, society is governed according to a code of law which everyone, even the monarch, at least technically, at least nominally, has to obey. Even in practice, they don't actually have to. And then also, in modern politics, a guild. A guild is it's a medieval European economic institution, although something akin to guilds has cropped up in many societies of pre-modernity, and it's basically a form of monopoly where, for example, if you go to a city, there'd be like a cobbler's guild, where only this one body of people, if you want to be a cobbler, i.e. a shoemaker, you have to be part of this body of people, and if you want shoes, you have to go part of that body of people. You have to go to someone in the cobbler's guild. And the idea of guilds massively discourages innovation in institution because there's no competition, i.e. you have a local monopoly on, i.e. a guild has a local monopoly on the production of distribution of a certain kind of good in that area. And as we've mentioned, we cannot have serfdom in politics because it means that we don't get the kind of landless labor class that is needed to provide the manpower for industrialization. So, we also need a political culture in which trade and commerce and the acquisition of profit is both permitted and also not overtly discouraged. Now, it's true that in European societies in the 1700s, most of people of power and wealth were aristocrats who tended to look down on the conduction of trade and commerce, and who generally didn't live their lives according to the acquisition of profit, but rather to the maintenance of their land and their power over others. But in Great Britain in the 1700s, we see a sizable class of businessmen, many of whom were wealthy enough to finance their own industrialization and who had the ability to do so, and a political culture and a political framework where they were allowed to do so, and where doing so wasn't social suicide, i.e. where they weren't despised as by everyone else for doing so. They were able to do so without loss of material goods, i.e. the state expropriating everything from them, or social status. Now, the ideas of private property, rule of law, and economic competition are fundamental in an ideology called liberalism. And liberalism is a political ideology which emerged in Europe in the 1700s, although it has some antecedent echoes in earlier eras, notably ancient Greece, but really liberalism evolved in the 1700s as a result of that phenomenon we discussed earlier called the Age of Enlightenment. And very, very few states, and basically, Great Britain was the only liberal state in the late 1700s, i.e. the only state which really had private property, rule of law, and modern economic/political institutions, or at least recognizably modern institutions of such, in the late 1700s. It was the only major country which met those conditions. Belgium and the Netherlands kind of arguably met those conditions, but they weren't great, they weren't powerful countries, and they didn't really have the population to sustain, not sustaining industrialization, but just because they didn't have a very large population, statistically, it was less likely that a phenomenon such as industrialization would occur because there were just fewer people to invent steam engines. There were just fewer people to establish factories. There were just fewer people who could man these factories, etc., etc. It makes overwhelming sense that industrialization occurred in Great Britain when it did, because it was the only country at this time which was organized on the basis of private property, rule of law, modern politics and economics, and which was strong enough to credibly maintain its own independence, and which was populous enough to actually have native British people, or Britons, invent the technology and then use the technology needed for industrialization. And liberalism is something that we're gonna be talking about in future episodes because it's a political phenomenon and it forms the basis and the root of modern politics. And it's something we're gonna be talking about. For now, I'm just gonna content myself with discussing why is it that liberalism particularly took hold in Great Britain. And that's because Great Britain had this quite long tradition of what we'd call pluralistic political institutions, i.e. political institutions that included a wider range of people with political power. And obviously Great Britain in the 1700s was far from a democracy, but it was quite a wide oligarchy. So Parliament was a thing in the late 1700s in Britain. And while the monarch was an element of Parliament, a powerful element of Parliament and legislation, Parliament's will had to actually be respected, with the effect that Parliament formed an oligarchy in the late 1700s, not just of feudal aristocrats, but also more forward-looking businessmen and industrialists and bankers as well. Or at the very least, people who had worked in India or in the East India Company and become fabulously wealthy and had gained a mindset of trade and commerce because of it. And the development of Parliament and liberalism in British history we can trace back to, many things. In 1688, I believe, an event in British history occurred called the Glorious Revolution, where basically Parliament asserted its ultimate will over the monarch. Parliament asserted in the Glorious Revolution of British history that it was sovereign in Britain, not the monarch. And what Parliament said went. And in doing so, in changing Britain from an absolute monarchy to a parliamentary monarchy, the number of people who held political power broadened extensively. Political institutions, we could say, became more pluralistic and inclusive. They still weren't objectively inclusive because the vast majority of people in Britain couldn't vote or hold political power. But the point is that out of all countries in the world at the time, in the late 1700s, with the exception of the USA, Britain had the most pluralistic political institutions. And pluralistic or inclusive political institutions are conducive towards a liberalism, i.e. private property, rule of law, and modern institutions. And it's conducive in that sense it's something that this is something that I explore in the episode of Polymath where I talk about why some countries are more developed than others. But generally, what I mean to say is that when political power is shared between a greater number of people, and when political power is shared between people who also have an interest in trade and commerce, they will pursue policies that are beneficial or at least facilitate trade and commerce. Which basically means that we have the development of things like private property and modern economic institutions. Also, if you have more inclusive political institutions, i.e. if political power is held not just by a great autocrat, but by a wider group of people, they're going to create political institutions that prevent one person, i.e. an autocrat, from just dictating everything that happens and who lives above the law. I.e. more inclusive political institutions can help establish rule of law. Now, the antecedents for the Glorious Revolution and the development of British trade and commerce and the development of a British class of people, of noblemen or at least gentlemen who had at least interest in trade and commerce, we can trace the development of this back from centuries in British history. We can even kind of trace the development of more inclusive political institutions in Britain to the signing of the Magna Carta in, I think, 1215 by King John. The point that I'm trying to make, however, is that Great Britain developed the political culture and the political and economic institutions that were classically needed for industrialization because of the political institutions that were already prevalent in Britain at the time. I.e., out of all the states in the world in the 1700s, apart from the USA, Britain had the most inclusive political institutions. And for all of these reasons combined, Great Britain was the country that industrialized first, and it industrialized in the late 1700s because it was only at around this time that all the prerequisites for industrialization were present. By extension, the West industrialized far earlier than any other region in the world because the technical, political, economic, and political economic conditions that are necessary for industrialization were present in Western institutions to a far greater degree than in the countries outside the West. What I hope I've proved to you in this episode is that industrialization could not have emerged outside the West. Specifically, even if it had emerged in the West outside of Great Britain, it would have definitely been later. It may not have happened at all, in fact, although it's likely that eventually, at some point in the 1800s or even the 1900s, some Western country would have industrialized for whatever reason. But what I'm trying to say is that it is, I'm not going to say a rule of history, because a huge amount of history is based on contingency and luck and just exceptional circumstances, but it is extremely likely, in however number of parallel universes you want to believe in, and whatever number of timelines you want to consider, it is extremely likely that in whatever parallel universe, Great Britain would have been the first country to industrialize. And it is extremely likely that this industrialization would not have happened before the latter half of the 18th century. And that's what I hope that I've proved to you. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is today's episode of Polymath. It's a bit of a long one and my throat is hoarse. It's really hurting, but you know what? It's worth it because I really enjoyed making the episode and I really hope that you guys have found this interesting as well. As always, anyone who tunes into any of my episodes, not least anyone who actually listens to them the whole damn way through, you know, I'm just honored. I'm really honored and I'm really flattered. And if you are listening to this right now, I bid you a lovely day and I hope that you have a good one. Take care. Bye bye.